I thought I was living peacefully in my little apartment after 30 years of marriage, but apparently my downstairs neighbor had other plans. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang at 7 a.m., my landlord's number flashing on the screen like a warning bell. "Mrs. Richardson," came Mr. Peterson's gruff voice. "I've received another complaint about excessive noise from your unit. The tenant below says you're stomping around at all hours, moving furniture, and playing loud music late into the night." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "Mr. Peterson, I live alone now. I wear slippers indoors, and I'm usually asleep by 9:30. There must be some mistake." But as the days passed, the calls kept coming. Complaints about cooking smells, alleged parties, imaginary pet noise. Each accusation more ridiculous than the last. This shocking tale will amaze you, so please support with a like and subscription. Tell me what part of the world you're from. Because what started as minor annoyances quickly escalated into a nightmare that threatened the roof over my head. My name is Dorothy Richardson. I'm 61 years old, and I never imagined that retirement would include fighting for my right to simply exist in my own home. The woman orchestrating this campaign against me was Brenda Walsh, my neighbor from apartment 2B, directly below mine. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway for 3 years without incident, but something had clearly changed in her attitude toward me recently. "Mom, this is absolutely insane," my daughter Sarah Richardson said when I called her after the 4th landlord complaint in 2 weeks. Sarah lived across town with her own family, but we spoke almost daily, and she knew my quiet routines better than anyone. "You barely make enough noise to wake a mouse? What could possibly be motivating this woman?" That's when my upstairs neighbor and friend, Helen Martinez, knocked on my door with information that made my blood run cold. Helen was a retired school secretary with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory for details, qualities that would prove invaluable in the coming weeks. "Dorothy, I've been watching this situation develop, and I think you need to know what I've observed," Helen said, settling into my kitchen chair with the serious expression she reserved for important matters. "I've seen Brenda Walsh timing her complaints. She calls your landlord right after normal daily activities, when you run your dishwasher, when you vacuum on Saturday mornings, even when you simply walk from your bedroom to the kitchen." The pieces started falling into place as Helen continued. "Yesterday, I watched her stand in the hallway with her ear pressed to your door for nearly 10 minutes. When you moved around doing what sounded like normal housework, she immediately went back to her apartment, and within an hour, I saw her on her phone in the courtyard, gesturing angrily." Sarah's voice rose with indignation when I relayed Helen's observations during our next conversation. "So she's essentially stalking you in your own home?" "Mom, this isn't just harassment. This is a deliberate campaign to get you evicted. But why would she want you gone so badly?" The answer to that question would unravel a web of deception I never saw coming. As I sat in my quiet apartment that evening, listening to the normal sounds of life around me, Helen's television upstairs, traffic outside, the building's old pipes settling, I realized that Brenda Walsh wasn't just making random complaints. There was a pattern, a purpose, and a calculated cruelty that suggested this wasn't really about noise at all. Helen had documented everything with the precision of someone accustomed to keeping detailed records. "She's called your landlord 11 times in 3 weeks, Dorothy. Each complaint has been strategically timed and deliberately vague enough that you can't definitively prove they're false, but specific enough to sound credible to someone who doesn't know your actual living habits." The trap I'd missed finally sprang shut. The trap I'd missed finally sprang shut about how I understood Brenda Walsh's motivations. While organizing my kitchen drawers that Thursday evening, a nervous habit I'd developed since the harassment began, I found the lease renewal letter I'd received 3 months ago. The rent increase was modest, much lower than what newer tenants were paying in similar buildings across the neighborhood. I called Sarah immediately, my hands trembling as I held the letter. Honey, I think I know why Brenda is doing this. Look at the timing. She moved in right after I signed my lease renewal at the old rate. What if she found out somehow that I'm paying significantly less rent than market value? Sarah's voice carried that analytical tone she used when solving problems at her job. Mom, that makes complete sense. If you get evicted, especially for cause like noise complaints, the landlord can reset the rent to current market rates for the next tenant. Brenda might think she can swoop in and get your apartment at a higher rate that still seems reasonable to her. The next morning, Helen knocked on my door earlier than usual, her face flushed with excitement and anger. Dorothy, you're not going to believe what I overheard last night. The walls in this old building are thin, and Brenda was on her phone around 11 o'clock, talking loud enough that I caught most of her conversation. I poured Helen her usual cup of coffee and settled across from her at my small dining table. The morning light streaming through my kitchen window felt different now. Less warm, more exposing, as if even the sun was revealing secrets I'd rather not know. She was talking to someone about apartment layouts. Helen continued, her retired secretary instincts clearly engaged. She kept saying things like, once the current tenant is gone, and the rent will be worth it for that much more space. Dorothy, she was discussing your apartment like it was already hers. My stomach twisted into knots as the full scope of Brenda's plan became clear. This wasn't about noise or neighborly disputes. This was calculated harassment designed to steal my home from under me. I'd lived in this apartment for 7 years, had painted the walls, tended the small herb garden on the fire escape, and built a life within these rooms that felt sacred to me. When I shared Helen's revelation with Sarah during our afternoon call, my daughter's protective instincts kicked into high gear. Mom, this is beyond harassment. This is fraud. She's essentially trying to manipulate your landlord into breaking your lease so she can benefit. We need to document everything and build a case that proves what she's really doing. But Brenda Walsh had underestimated the three of us. Over the next few days, Helen began what she called strategic observation, keeping detailed notes of Brenda's activities, phone calls, and the timing of her complaints. Sarah started researching tenant rights and documentation requirements, and I began recording every sound in my apartment with the voice memo app on my phone, creating an audio diary of my actual daily activities. The breakthrough came when Helen discovered something that made my blood run cold. Dorothy, I figured out how she knew about your rent, Helen said, practically vibrating with nervous energy as she stood in my doorway. Yesterday, I saw her coming out of the building manager's office with papers in her hand. When I asked casual questions, I learned she'd submitted what she called a preliminary rental application for your unit. Sarah's reaction when I told her was swift and fierce. She filed a rental application for an occupied apartment? Mom, she's so confident she can get you evicted that she's already trying to secure the lease. This isn't harassment anymore. This is a coordinated scheme. As we sat in my living room that evening, Helen, Sarah, and I, planning our counter strategy, I realized how grateful I was for these two women who'd become my advocates and protectors. The apartment felt less like a target and more like a fortress with them beside me. But just as we thought we understood the full scope of Brenda's plan, Helen's phone rang with news that turned our entire understanding upside down. Helen's phone buzzed insistently as we spread our documentation across my coffee table. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. It's my daughter calling from college, Helen said, her voice tight with worry. She never calls this late unless something's wrong. Sarah and I exchanged glances as Helen answered. Katie, what's wrong, honey? Even from across the room, I could hear the distress in Katie's voice through the phone. Helen's expression grew increasingly alarmed as she listened. "Slow down, sweetheart. Start from the beginning," Helen said, putting the phone on speaker so we could help. "You're saying someone called your dorm?" Katie's voice filled my living room, shaky and confused. "Mom, this woman called the front desk at my dorm tonight. She told them she was a family friend and that there was an emergency at home. When they transferred her to my room, she started asking all these weird questions about you and your living situation." My heart stopped. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with shock. Helen's voice was deadly calm. "What kind of questions, Katie?" "She asked if you were really my mom, how long you'd lived in your apartment, whether you had financial problems. When I asked who she was, she said she was trying to help you with some housing issues. But Mom, something felt really wrong about it. She knew details about your building and your neighbors that a family friend wouldn't know." Sarah leaned forward, her lawyer instincts fully activated. "Katie, did she give you her name?" "She said her name was Brenda and that she lived next door to Mom." She kept pushing me to confirm personal details about our family. I hung up on her when she asked about Mom's income. Helen's hands were shaking now. "Dorothy, she called my daughter at college. She tracked down my child to try to get information about me." The full horror of what Brenda was doing crashed over me. This wasn't just about my apartment anymore. She was involving Helen's family, crossing boundaries I hadn't even imagined she would cross. "Mom, there's more," Katie continued, her voice small. "After I hung up, I was so rattled that I called the front desk to ask how she got through. The desk clerk said the woman was very convincing, claiming she was calling about a family emergency. But here's the weird part. She asked them to confirm my last name and which room I was in before they would transfer her call. Like she wasn't completely sure she had the right person." Sarah stood up, pacing now. "She's conducting reconnaissance. She's trying to verify information about Helen to use against you somehow, Dorothy. This is stalking behavior." Helen ended the call with Katie after reassuring her daughter she was safe, then turned to face us with an expression I'd never seen before. Gone was the sweet, gentle neighbor I knew. In her place was a mother whose child had been threatened. "Dorothy, I've been trying to give Brenda the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe she was just overzealous about the apartment situation. But she crossed a line tonight that I will not tolerate. Nobody, and I mean nobody, involves my daughter in their schemes." I felt sick thinking about Katie, alone in her dorm room, being manipulated by Brenda's lies. "Helen, I'm so sorry. I never imagined she would go after your family." "This isn't your fault," Helen said firmly. "But it ends now. We're not just defending your apartment anymore. We're stopping someone who's escalating into dangerous behavior." Sarah sat back down, her expression serious. "We need to think about why she would target Katie. What information could she possibly get from Helen's daughter that would help her case against you?" Helen was quiet for a moment, thinking. "She's trying to discredit me as a witness. If she can find any inconsistencies in what I've told you about her behavior, or if she can make it seem like I'm an unreliable neighbor with my own problems, it weakens my testimony about her false complaints." The sophistication of Brenda's planning was becoming terrifyingly clear. She wasn't just making random complaints about noise. She was systematically working to isolate me, discredit my witnesses, and create a narrative that would convince my landlord I was a problem tenant. Sarah pulled out her notebook. "Okay, let's think through what we know she's done so far. She's filed false noise complaints. She's submitted a rental application for Dorothy's apartment. She's been discussing the apartment with a realtor like it's already available, and now she's contacted Helen's family to gather information. This is a coordinated campaign?" Helen nodded grimly. And if she's willing to call Katie at college, what else is she willing to do? Has she been researching all of us online? Does she know where Sarah works? What about Dorothy's family members? The thought sent chills down my spine. I'd been thinking of this as a housing dispute, but Brenda's behavior was revealing something much darker about her character. We need to be smarter than she is, I said, finding my voice again. She's been treating this like a game where she holds all the cards. But now we know the scope of what she's doing. Sarah looked up from her notes. And she made a crucial mistake tonight. By involving Katie, she's created evidence of harassment that extends beyond housing complaints. She's documented her own stalking behavior. Helen's phone buzzed again, and we all froze. But this time, it was just a text message. Helen looked at the screen, and her face went white. It's from an unknown number, Helen said quietly. It says, "Your daughter seems lovely. I hope she's focusing on her studies instead of spreading rumors about her neighbors." The message hung in the air like a threat. Brenda wasn't just gathering information. She was sending a message that she could reach any of us, anywhere, anytime. Sarah grabbed the phone to screenshot the message. "This changes everything. This isn't about your apartment anymore, Dorothy. This is about stopping someone who's clearly unstable." But as we stared at that threatening text message, none of us could have predicted what we would discover about Brenda Walsh's past when Helen made a phone call that would unravel the entire mystery. Helen stared at the threatening text message, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't believe she contacted Katie. My daughter is 3 states away, trying to focus on her finals, and now she has to deal with this woman's harassment." I watched my friend's face transform from shock to something I'd rarely seen in Helen before. Pure maternal fury. In all the years I'd known her, Helen had always been the diplomatic one, the peacemaker who could find common ground with anyone. But threatening her daughter had crossed a line that changed everything. "Helen, I'm so sorry this has pulled your family into it," I said, reaching for her hand. I never imagined when I first complained about the noise that it would escalate to this. "This isn't your fault, Dorothy," Helen said firmly, her voice steadier now. "You have every right to peaceful enjoyment of your home. What Brenda is doing is completely unhinged." Sarah had been quiet for several minutes, studying the screenshot of the threatening message. "Helen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Has Katie mentioned anything unusual happening at school lately? Any strange phone calls? People asking questions about her? Anything that seemed off?" Helen's face went pale. "Actually, yes. About 2 weeks ago, Katie mentioned that someone had called her dorm room asking if she was Helen Morrison's daughter. Katie said the woman claimed to be from some kind of housing survey, asking about rental experiences and neighbor relationships. Katie thought it was weird because she's never rented an apartment, but she answered a few questions before hanging up." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Brenda had been researching and contacting Helen's family for weeks, long before any of us realized the scope of her campaign. 2 weeks ago? I repeated slowly. That's around the time she first started calling Mr. Peterson about noise complaints. She was already building her case against me and gathering information about potential witnesses. Sarah leaned forward, her analytical mind clearly working through the timeline. This means she's been planning this systematically from the very beginning. The noise complaints weren't random harassment. They were part of a larger strategy to isolate you and discredit anyone who might support you. Helen stood up abruptly and began pacing around my small living room. I keep thinking about how normal she seemed when she first moved in. She was polite, quiet, always said hello. How did I miss that she was capable of this level of manipulation? Because normal people don't expect this kind of behavior, I said. We're conditioned to give people the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions. Brenda has been counting on that. Sarah pulled out her notebook again and started writing. Let's map out what we know she's done and when. Dorothy, when did you first notice the noise complaints were happening? About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Peterson first mentioned that he'd received a complaint about loud music. I was confused because I rarely play music, and never loudly. And when did she submit the rental application for your apartment? Helen found out about that just over a week ago. Helen stopped pacing and turned to face us. Which means she filed the application while actively complaining about Dorothy to the landlord. She was essentially applying to replace the tenant she was trying to get evicted. The calculated nature of Brenda's plan was becoming more disturbing by the minute. This wasn't someone who had simply decided she wanted a different apartment. This was someone who had identified a target and systematically worked to destroy that person's housing situation. There's something else, Helen said quietly, sitting back down. When Katie told me about that phone call, she mentioned that the woman seemed to know details about our family that she shouldn't have known. She asked Katie if her mother was close friends with the elderly woman in apartment 2B. My blood ran cold. Elderly woman in 2B? That's how she described me? Katie said the woman seemed to already know that I spent time at your apartment, that we were close friends. She wasn't gathering information. She was confirming information she already had. Sarah looked up from her notes with a grim expression. Which means she's been watching and documenting Dorothy's visitors, probably taking photos, keeping track of comings and goings. This is full-scale surveillance. The weight of being watched, monitored, and documented hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all the evenings Helen and I had spent together, all the times Sarah had come over to help with household projects, all the normal interactions of daily life that Brenda had been cataloging as evidence for some twisted case against me. I feel so violated, I whispered. My own home doesn't feel safe anymore. Helen immediately moved to sit beside me on the couch. We're not going to let her win, Dorothy, but we need to be smart about how we handle this. The question is, what's her endgame? Sarah asked. Let's say she succeeds in getting Dorothy evicted. Then what? She moves into this apartment and goes back to being the perfect neighbor? Helen shook her head. People who do this kind of thing don't just stop. If she's willing to harass a college student to get what she wants, if she's willing to conduct surveillance and make threats, then this behavior will continue. You mean she'll target other people? I mean, she's shown us who she really is, and now we know we're living next door to someone who's genuinely dangerous. As if summoned by our conversation, we heard the sound of Brenda's door opening and closing, followed by footsteps in the hallway. All three of us froze, listening as she walked past my door. The footsteps paused for just a moment, long enough to make it clear she knew we were all inside, before continuing toward the building entrance. She's going out, Sarah whispered. This might be our chance. Our chance to do what? Helen's expression had changed again, and I recognized the determined look she got when she'd made up her mind about something important. Our chance to find out who we're really dealing with. I think it's time I made that phone call I've been considering. What phone call? To my cousin who works in property management downtown. If Brenda has done this before, if she has a history of harassing neighbors or manipulating landlords, there might be a paper trail. But as Helen reached for her phone, we heard those footsteps returning much sooner than expected. And this time they were accompanied by voices. Brenda's voice and another voice we didn't recognize, both stopping directly outside my door. We held our breath, straining to hear the conversation just outside my door. The voices were muffled, but Brenda's distinctive tone was unmistakable as she spoke in hushed, urgent whispers with someone else. "This is unbelievable," Sarah mouthed silently, gesturing toward the door. "She brought someone back with her." Helen pressed her finger to her lips and motioned for us to move away from the door, but the apartment was small, and the voices carried through the thin walls. I caught fragments of Brenda's conversation, words like noise violations and lease agreement, and something that sounded like photographic evidence. My stomach dropped. She wasn't just talking to a friend or neighbor. This sounded official. The voices moved away from my door, heading toward Brenda's apartment, and we heard 2 doors open and close. Helen immediately grabbed my arm. "Dorothy, I think she just brought someone from the property management company to document her complaints." "On a Sunday evening?" I whispered back. Some property managers work irregular hours, especially if they think there's an urgent situation. If she convinced them you were causing major disruptions. Sarah was already moving toward the window that faced the street. "There's a car out there I don't recognize. White sedan with some kind of clipboard or folder visible on the dashboard." The reality of the situation hit me all over again. While we had been in here planning and strategizing, Brenda had been taking action. She wasn't just making phone calls anymore. She was escalating to in-person visits, bringing people to the building, building her case in real time. "I need to call Mr. Chen right now," I said, reaching for my phone. "If she's got someone here making some kind of official report, I need to make sure he hears my side immediately." But Helen caught my hand before I could dial. "Wait, think about this for a minute. If you call him now, while they're here, it's going to look reactive, like you only called because you got caught doing something wrong. But if I don't call, and they file some kind of report, then we document everything ourselves," Sarah interrupted. "Right now, while it's happening, get your phone and start recording audio of whatever's going on over there. If she's making false statements to an official person, we need proof of what she's actually saying versus what she claims you're doing." I could hear movement and conversation from Brenda's apartment, though the specific words weren't clear. What was clear was that this wasn't a brief, casual conversation. Whatever was happening over there, it was thorough and deliberate. Helen started pacing the small space between my kitchen and living room. "This changes everything. If she's bringing property management people here, if she's filing formal complaints, then she's not just trying to annoy you into leaving. She's building an actual case for eviction." "Which means she's done this before," Sarah added grimly. "Normal people don't know how to navigate property management systems this effectively. This isn't her first time." 20 minutes passed before we heard Brenda's door open again. The voices moved back into the hallway, and this time we could hear them more clearly as they approached the building entrance. "I appreciate you coming out on short notice," Brenda was saying. "I just felt it was important to document the ongoing situation before it got any worse." A male voice responded, though his words weren't as distinct. I caught something about following proper procedures and reviewing the lease terms. Then they were gone, footsteps echoing down the hallway and out of the building. The 3 of us sat in complete silence for several minutes after we heard the car start and drive away. "Okay," Helen finally said. "Now we call your landlord, not to react to whatever just happened, but to get ahead of whatever complaint she just filed." My hands were shaking as I dialed Mr. Chen's number. It went straight to voicemail, which somehow made everything feel worse. I left a brief message asking him to call me back about some concerns regarding my tenancy, trying to sound calm and professional despite the panic rising in my chest. "What if she convinced them?" I asked after hanging up. "What if whoever she brought here believed everything she said?" Sarah sat down across from me at my small kitchen table. Then we prove she's lying. We have Helen's documentation, we have your clean track record, and now we know she's actively working to build a false case against you. But what if that's not enough? Helen stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Have you considered that maybe fighting this isn't worth it? That maybe finding a different apartment, getting away from this situation entirely, might be the better choice? The question hit me like cold water. In all our planning and strategizing, the possibility of just giving up and moving hadn't really been on the table. But now, faced with the reality of Brenda's escalating campaign against me, the idea of simply walking away had a certain appeal. You mean let her win? I mean protect yourself. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is remove yourself from a toxic situation, even when you're not the one causing the problem. Sarah leaned forward. But if Helen's right about Brenda having done this before, then walking away doesn't really solve anything. It just makes it easier for her to do it to the next person. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Mr. Chen's name appeared on the screen, and my heart rate immediately spiked. Dorothy, he said when I answered, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from him before. I think we need to talk. The pit in my stomach deepened at the formal, almost cold way Mr. Chen said my name. In the 2 years I'd lived here, he'd always been warm and friendly. This version of my landlord felt like a stranger. Of course, I managed, acutely aware that Helen and Sarah were watching my face for any sign of what his tone might mean. Would you like me to come to your office or? I think it would be best if I came by your apartment. I'd like to see the current condition of the unit myself. Would this evening work? Around 7? The request sent ice through my veins. Landlords didn't ask for impromptu inspections unless something was seriously wrong. Yes, that's fine. Is there anything specific I should prepare for? A long pause. Just make sure the apartment is accessible for a full walkthrough. We'll discuss the details when I arrive. He hung up without his usual pleasantries, leaving me staring at my phone with a growing sense of dread. Well? Sarah asked when I set the phone down. He's coming here at 7 tonight. Wants to do a full walkthrough of the apartment. My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. He was so formal, so distant. Nothing like how he usually talks to me. Helen sank into the chair beside Sarah, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. She got to him first. Whatever she told that person she brought here, they've already contacted Mr. Chen with their version of events. But the apartment's fine, Sarah said, gesturing around my small but tidy living space. There's nothing wrong here that any reasonable person could find fault with. You're assuming they're looking for reasonable problems? Helen replied grimly. If Brenda's taught me anything, it's that determined people can find issues where none exist. A small scuff on the wall becomes property damage. Normal wear and tear becomes negligent maintenance. I walked to my kitchen window, the one that looked directly across the courtyard to Brenda's unit. Her blinds were closed, but somehow I could feel her watching, waiting to see the outcome of whatever trap she'd set in motion. I need to clean, I said suddenly, my voice rising with panic. I need to make sure everything is perfect. The bathroom grout, the baseboards, maybe I should vacuum again? And what about the refrigerator? When was the last time I cleaned behind the refrigerator? Dorothy, stop! Sarah stood and placed her hands on my shoulders, forcing me to look at her instead of frantically scanning my apartment for imaginary flaws. You're spiraling. The apartment is clean. It's always been clean. We're not going to let you exhaust yourself trying to achieve some impossible standard of perfection. But what if it's not enough? What if whatever Brenda told them was so convincing that he's already decided to evict me, and this inspection is just a formality? Helen stood up slowly, her expression shifting from worried to determined. Then we make sure he hears the truth. Not just about the condition of your apartment, but about what's really been happening here. You mean tell him about Brenda's complaints being false? I mean, we present the facts, the timeline of her complaints, the lack of substance behind them, and the pattern of harassment you've been experiencing. Helen's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I've lived here longer than anyone except Mrs. Patterson in 2C. My word carries weight with Mr. Chen. Sarah nodded. And we'll be here with you when he comes. You don't have to face this alone. The relief that flooded through me at those words was almost overwhelming. For weeks, I'd felt isolated and vulnerable, jumping at every sound in the hallway, second-guessing every decision. Having Helen and Sarah firmly in my corner felt like finally having solid ground under my feet. You'd really do that? Stay here during the inspection? Try to keep us away, Sarah said with a small smile. Though we should probably discuss strategy first. How much do we tell him? Do we lay out everything we suspect about Brenda's pattern? Or do we stick to just the facts about your tenancy? Helen considered this carefully. We start conservative. Let him explain what complaints he's received, and then we address each one specifically with documentation. If he seems receptive, we can broaden the conversation to include the bigger picture. The next few hours passed in a blur of nervous preparation. Despite Sarah's protests, I couldn't help but tidy up things that were already clean, reorganizing my already neat closet and scrubbing the bathroom sink until it gleamed. Helen went back to her apartment to gather the documentation she'd been keeping, while Sarah helped me organize my own records. At 6:45, we sat around my kitchen table like a war council, papers spread before us, waiting for the knock that would determine my future in this apartment. When it came, the sound was firm and businesslike, so different from Helen's gentle taps or Sarah's casual raps on the door. I stood on shaking legs, took a deep breath, and opened the door to find Mr. Chen standing in the hallway with a clipboard and an expression I couldn't read. Dorothy, he said with a nod, then noticed Helen and Sarah behind me. I wasn't expecting a committee. They're here for moral support, I said quickly. Is that a problem? He studied the three of us for a long moment, and I held my breath, wondering if having witnesses would work for or against me. Finally, he stepped into the apartment. Actually, it might be helpful to have other long-term residents here. This situation has become more complicated than I initially realized. The words, more complicated than I initially realized, sent a chill through me, but Mr. Chen's tone wasn't accusatory. If anything, he sounded tired, like someone who'd been dealing with a persistent headache. Please, sit down, I offered, gesturing toward the living room. Can I get you some coffee or water? Coffee would be appreciated, thank you. He settled into the armchair while Helen and Sarah took the couch. I busied myself in the kitchen, grateful for something to do with my shaking hands while listening to the conversation. Mr. Chen? Helen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in the building for decades. I hope you don't mind my being direct, but Dorothy has been an exemplary neighbor. In all my years here, I've never had cause for complaint about her conduct. That's what makes this situation so puzzling, he replied, accepting the coffee cup from my trembling hands. Mrs. Kowalski has contacted me 7 times in the past 3 weeks. Each complaint has been quite detailed and specific. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of specific? Mr. Chen consulted his clipboard. Loud music at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. Cooking smells that allegedly made her physically ill. claims that Dorothy has been slamming doors deliberately to disturb her sleep. Most recently, she insisted there was a strong chemical smell coming from this apartment that she believed indicated drug manufacturing. The last accusation hit me like a physical blow. Drug manufacturing? I don't even take aspirin without reading the bottle 3 times. I told her that seemed unlikely, Mr. Chen said mildly. Which is why I wanted to see the apartment for myself and speak with you directly. Helen's expression had grown increasingly stern as the list continued. Did Mrs. Kowalski provide any evidence for these claims? Recordings of the alleged noise? Photos of anything suspicious? No physical evidence, but she's been very persistent, calling at all hours. Yesterday, she threatened to contact the health department if I didn't take immediate action. I sank into the remaining chair, feeling overwhelmed by the escalation. I don't understand why she's doing this. I've barely interacted with her beyond saying hello in the hallway. That might be part of the problem, Sarah said quietly. Some people interpret keeping to yourself as being secretive or hostile. Mr. Chen was looking around the apartment as we talked, and I found myself seeing it through his eyes. The neat living room, the organized kitchen visible through the pass-through, the complete absence of anything that could support Brenda's complaints. The only smells were the coffee we were drinking and perhaps a faint trace of the lemon cleaner I'd used on the bathroom earlier. Dorothy, he said after a moment, would you mind if I looked around? Not because I believe the complaints, but because I need to be thorough in my documentation. Of course. I stood immediately. Please, look at whatever you need to see. He moved through the apartment methodically, opening cabinets in the kitchen, checking the bathroom, even glancing into the bedroom. Helen and Sarah followed at a respectful distance while I hovered anxiously near the kitchen counter. The cooking smell complaint, he said, returning to the living room. What was that about, do you think? I thought back through the previous weeks. I made curry about 2 weeks ago. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had the windows open. The smell probably drifted into the hallway, but it was just regular cooking. I remember that, Helen said suddenly. It smelled wonderful. I almost knocked on your door to ask for the recipe. And the music complaint? This one had me completely stumped. Mr. Chen, I don't own a stereo system. I have my laptop, and sometimes I watch shows with headphones on, but I'm usually asleep by 10:30 on weeknights. Sarah nodded. I can vouch for that. Our bedrooms share a wall, and if Dorothy were playing loud music at 2 a.m., I'd definitely know about it. Mr. Chen made notes on his clipboard, and something in his expression suggested he was reaching the same conclusion we'd already arrived at. But before anyone could say more, we heard footsteps in the hallway outside, followed by 3 sharp knocks on the door. That's probably Mrs. Kowalski now, Mr. Chen said with a sigh. She mentioned she might stop by during my visit to provide additional information. My stomach dropped. I'd been hoping to resolve this situation without a direct confrontation, but apparently Brenda had other plans. Helen reached over and squeezed my hand as the knocking came again, more insistent this time. Well, Sarah said grimly, I guess we're about to get to the bottom of this. I walked to the door on unsteady legs, acutely aware of my 3 supporters behind me. Taking a deep breath, I opened it to find Brenda standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, her face set in the familiar expression of righteous indignation I'd come to dread. Mrs. Kowalski, Mr. Chen said, stepping forward. Thank you for coming by. I was just finishing up my inspection. Brenda's eyes swept past him to take in Helen and Sarah standing in my living room. I see Dorothy's managed to gather her little support group, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I hope you're not letting them influence your investigation, Mr. Chen. I'm documenting everything thoroughly, he replied diplomatically. Would you like to walk me through your specific concerns? Where do I even start? Brenda gestured dramatically toward my apartment. The cooking smells that permeate the entire hallway, the music at all hours, the general disruption to the peaceful atmosphere we used to have here. Sarah stepped forward, and I could see her jaw tighten. Brenda, I live right next door to Dorothy. If there were music at all hours, don't you think I'd be the first to complain? Maybe you're just a heavy sleeper, Brenda shot back. Or maybe you don't want to admit there's a problem because you're friends with her. Actually, Helen interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised children and wasn't intimidated by petty conflicts. I think the real question is why you're so focused on Dorothy specifically. I've lived in this building for 15 years, and I've never seen you this concerned about any other neighbor. Brenda's face flushed red. That's because no other neighbor has been as disruptive as she has. You don't understand what it's like living directly above someone who shows such blatant disregard for others. What disregard? I finally found my voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. Brenda, I work, I come home, I cook dinner, I watch television quietly, and I go to bed. I've tried to be a good neighbor. I've tried to say hello when I see you, but you barely acknowledge me. Because you're standoffish and unfriendly, she snapped. You act like you're too good for the rest of us. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. Sarah immediately moved to stand beside me, her presence a comfort. Being quiet and keeping to yourself isn't the same as being unfriendly, Sarah said firmly. Dorothy is one of the kindest people I know. She's just not someone who forces conversation on people who clearly don't want it. Mr. Chen had been taking notes throughout this exchange, and now he cleared his throat. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to tell you that I've found no evidence to support any of your complaints. The apartment is clean, well-maintained, and there are no signs of the issues you've described. Brenda's expression grew even more hostile. Of course you didn't find anything today. She obviously cleaned up because she knew you were coming. The cooking smell complaint from 2 weeks ago, Helen said suddenly. I remember that day perfectly. Dorothy made curry on a Saturday afternoon with her windows open. It was delicious smelling, and it was completely normal cooking. I've made fish that probably smelled stronger. And the noise complaints make no sense, Sarah added. I can hear when Dorothy's home, when she's watching TV, when she's moving around. There's never been loud music, especially not at 2 a.m. I watched Brenda's face as my friends defended me, and something shifted in her expression. The righteous anger faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like embarrassment or shame. You don't understand, she said, but her voice had lost some of its venom. It's not just about the noise or the smells. It's about respect, about consideration for your neighbors. But Dorothy has been considerate, Mr. Chen said quietly. Mrs. Kowalski, I have to ask you directly. Is there something else going on here? Some other issue between you two that might be influencing these complaints? The hallway fell silent. Brenda looked from Mr. Chen to me, then to Sarah and Helen, and I could see something crumbling in her expression. I just think, she said slowly, that people should make an effort to be part of the community, to be neighborly. The words hung in the air, and suddenly I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't really about cooking smells or imaginary music. This was about loneliness, about feeling excluded from connections she saw forming around her. But before I could process this realization fully, or figure out how to respond, Brenda's expression hardened again, the vulnerable moment passing. Regardless, she said, her voice sharp once more, I stand by my complaints, and if nothing changes, I'll continue to document every disturbance and every violation of the lease terms. Mr. Chen's pen stopped moving on his clipboard, and he looked up at her with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Kowalski, I need you to understand something very clearly. Mr. Chen's pen stopped moving on his clipboard, and he looked up at her with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Kowalski, I need you to understand something very clearly. Filing false complaints is a serious matter. It wastes my time, creates unnecessary stress for other tenants, and could potentially constitute harassment." Brenda's face flushed red. "False complaints? How dare you suggest that I'm lying?" "I'm not suggesting it," Mr. Chen said calmly. "I'm stating it based on the evidence I've gathered today. The noise complaints about loud music at 2 a.m, the claims about strong cooking odors that violate lease terms, the allegations about apartment damage. None of these have any basis in reality." I felt my heart racing. Part of me was relieved to hear Mr. Chen finally addressing this directly. But another part of me worried that this confrontation might only make things worse. Helen stepped closer to where I was standing. "Dorothy, you've been dealing with this for months, haven't you? The stress must have been awful." "It has been," I admitted quietly. I started second-guessing everything I did, whether I was walking too loudly, whether my cooking really did smell bad, whether I was somehow being a terrible neighbor without realizing it. Sarah shook her head. "That's exactly what this kind of behavior does to people. It makes you doubt yourself even when you're doing nothing wrong." Brenda looked between us, her expression growing more defensive. "You're all ganging up on me now. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You form your little clique and make me out to be the villain." The word clique hung in the air, and I realized how this must look from her perspective. Here were 3 of us, clearly supporting each other, while she stood alone in the hallway. But that didn't excuse months of false complaints that had nearly gotten me evicted. Mr. Chen cleared his throat again. "Mrs. Kowalski, this isn't about taking sides. This is about documented complaints that have proven to be unfounded. I need you to understand that if this pattern continues, there could be consequences for you as well." "Consequences for me?" Brenda's voice rose sharply. "I'm the one who's been suffering through months of disturbances. I'm the one who's been losing sleep and having to deal with constant cooking smells that make me sick to my stomach." "But there's no evidence of any of those things," Mr. Chen said patiently. "The apartment is spotless. The neighbors confirm there's no excessive noise, and normal cooking odors aren't a lease violation." I watched Brenda's face cycle through emotions: anger, frustration, and something that might have been desperation. It struck me again how isolated she seemed, how she'd mentioned wanting people to be part of the community and neighborly. Maybe this whole situation had spiraled from something much smaller and sadder than I'd realized. "Brenda," I said softly, and everyone turned to look at me. "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot somehow. I never meant to be inconsiderate, and if there's something specific that's bothering you, maybe we could talk about it." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected me to address her directly, let alone with any kindness. Sarah gave me a look that clearly said, "Are you sure about this?" But I felt like I had to try. Living with this level of hostility right next door wasn't sustainable for any of us. "I don't need your pity," Brenda said, but the venom had gone out of her voice. "It's not pity," I said. "It's just that we're neighbors. We're going to be living next to each other, and this situation isn't working for anyone." Mr. Chen was watching this exchange with interest, his pen poised over his clipboard, but not writing. "The complaints have to stop," he said firmly. "But Dorothy's right that you're neighbors, and finding a way to coexist peacefully would benefit everyone." Brenda looked down at her hands, then back up at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. You really want to talk? After everything I've put you through? I think it's worth trying, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I meant it. But before anyone could respond, Brenda's expression suddenly shifted again, hardening into something cold and calculating. Actually, you know what? I don't think talking will solve anything at all. Some people just aren't compatible as neighbors, and maybe it's time we all accepted that fact. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees, and I realized this wasn't over at all. The shift in Brenda's tone sent a chill through me. One moment she'd seemed almost vulnerable, maybe even open to working things out, and now she was back to that calculating coldness that had started this whole mess. What do you mean by that? Mr. Chen asked, his professional demeanor sharpening. I could tell he'd caught the change in her tone, too. Brenda straightened up, and I watched her transform before my eyes. Gone was any hint of the lonely, isolated woman I'd glimpsed moments before. This was the Brenda who had spent months making my life miserable, and she was back in full force. I mean that some people just don't belong in certain places, she said, her eyes fixed on me. Some people attract chaos and disruption wherever they go, and no amount of talking is going to change that fundamental incompatibility. I felt my stomach drop. After everything we'd just been through, after Mr. Chen had made it clear that her complaints were baseless, she was doubling down. The brief moment where I'd thought we might actually resolve this had evaporated completely. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen said firmly, I need to be very clear about something. The investigation is closed. The complaints were unfounded. If you continue to file false reports, there will be serious consequences, including potential legal action for harassment. But Brenda wasn't even looking at him anymore. Her attention was entirely focused on me, and there was something unsettling in her expression that made me take an unconscious step closer to Sarah. You think you've won something here? Brenda said to me, ignoring Mr. Chen completely. You think because he's taking your side that this is over? But you don't understand how this works. There are always ways to make someone's life difficult when they don't fit in. The threat was barely veiled, and I felt a surge of anger mixed with genuine fear. This woman had already shown she was willing to lie and manipulate to try to get me evicted. What else might she be capable of? Are you threatening Dorothy? Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp with protective anger. Because if you are, we need to make sure Mr. Chen documents that along with everything else. I'm not threatening anyone, Brenda said smoothly. I'm simply observing that some living situations just don't work out, no matter what anyone tries to do about it. Mr. Chen was writing furiously on his clipboard now, and I could see the concern in his expression. This had gone well beyond a simple neighbor dispute, and we all knew it. I stood there in that hallway, looking at this woman who had made my life hell for months, and realized that my attempt at kindness had been not just rejected, but twisted into something else entirely. The desperate loneliness I'd glimpsed in her had been real, but so was this vindictive streak that seemed to run much deeper than I'd understood. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. I'm going to need you to understand something very clearly. Any further harassment of Dorothy will result in immediate action from the building management. This includes indirect threats, continued false complaints, and any other behavior that could be construed as intimidation. Brenda finally turned to look at him, and for a moment, her mask slipped again. I saw fear there, and a kind of frantic desperation that made me realize she might be even less stable than I'd thought. Fine, she said, but her voice was shaking now. Fine, but don't come crying to me when the problems start up again. Some people just bring trouble with them wherever they go. She turned and walked back toward her apartment, her movements stiff and angry. I watched her go, my mind racing with questions about what had just happened and what it might mean for my future here. Mr. Chen waited until we heard her door close before speaking again. Dorothy, Sarah, I want you both to know that I'm taking this very seriously. I'll be filing a comprehensive report, and Mrs. Patterson will be formally warned about her behavior. What if she doesn't stop? I asked, the question that had been gnawing at me finally spilling out. What if she finds other ways to make trouble? Then we document everything and take progressively stronger action, he said. But I want you to understand that you have rights as a tenant, and the building has an obligation to ensure you can live here peacefully. Sarah put her arm around my shoulders, and I realized I was shaking slightly. The confrontation, the brief hope that we might resolve things, and then Brenda's final threatening behavior had left me feeling drained and uncertain. Thank you, I said to Mr. Chen. I really appreciate you taking the time to investigate properly. It's my job, he said, but his tone was kind. And Dorothy, you've handled this situation with a lot more grace than many people would have. Don't let her make you doubt that you belong here. As he walked away and Sarah and I headed back into my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. Brenda's parting words had carried a promise of future trouble that left me wondering what else she might have in store. But for the first time in months, I also felt like I wasn't facing it alone.